She thought she had the perfect marriage, but when her husband's affair with his boss spirals out of control, a deadly confrontation leaves one person dead and two lives shattered forever. What pushed her to the brink? And how did a love triangle turn into a fatal betrayal? Stay tuned as we uncover the chilling truth behind this shocking crime. What began as harmless flirting quickly morphed into something far more dangerous. Mark Rivers had convinced himself that his feelings for Vanessa Pierce, his boss, were nothing more than a fleeting attraction, a temporary distraction from the pressures of work and the growing mundanity of his home life. He believed he was in control, that he could manage the situation without it spiraling out of hand. But he was wrong. Mark was playing with fire, and the sparks of attraction between him and Vanessa were rapidly turning into a blaze neither of them could contain. It started subtly. Vanessa, always the confident and assertive leader, began to invite Mark for one-on-one late-night meetings, often at her private office or in upscale bars away from prying eyes. At first, they kept the conversation professional, discussing work strategy, company expansion, and the future of Pierce Innovations. Vanessa made it clear that she saw Mark as a key player in the company's growth, and her praise for his talents gave him a rush of pride. He felt valued, important, and undeniably flattered. But there was an underlying tension in these meetings, a current of electricity that neither could ignore. Vanessa was a beautiful woman, older than Mark but exuding an air of sophistication and power that intrigued him. Her casual touches, a hand on his arm, a lingering glance sent Mark's heart racing. He knew the line between professionalism and something more was dangerously thin, but each meeting, each exchange made him want to push the boundaries a little further. One evening, after an intense discussion about a major project, Vanessa offered to drive Mark home. It seemed like a casual gesture, but Mark sensed there was more behind it. As they sat in the car, Vanessa turned to him and said, "You know, Mark, I've always admired your drive. You're not like the others here. You have potential, real potential. I see something special in you." Her words were laced with meaning, and Mark could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. He should have said something to diffuse the situation, to keep things from crossing a line. But instead, he found himself caught in her gaze, drawn in by the intensity of her attention. "I couldn't have done any of it without your guidance," Mark replied, his voice low and filled with a nervous excitement. Vanessa smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a chill down his spine. "It's more than just guidance, Mark. It's you. You have a fire in you, a hunger to succeed. I like that. I like people who know what they want and aren't afraid to go after it." In that moment, the air between them shifted. What had once been subtle flirtation was now undeniably something more. Vanessa leaned in slightly, her hand brushing against his on the center console. The contact sent a jolt through Mark, and before he could think, before he could rationalize, he kissed her. The kiss was brief but electric, a release of the tension that had been building for weeks. When they pulled apart, there was a moment of silence, both of them processing what had just happened. Vanessa's expression was unreadable, but her eyes sparkled with satisfaction. "I knew it," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I knew you felt it too." Mark's mind raced. This wasn't just a mistake, it was the start of something he couldn't undo. He had crossed the line. "Vanessa," he started, but she cut him off with a gentle finger to his lips. "Don't worry, Mark," she said with a calm confidence. "I don't expect anything you're not willing to give. But if you want this, if you want more, I'm not going anywhere." The game had begun, and Mark was no longer in control. Over the next few weeks, their relationship deepened, evolving from stolen kisses to full-blown secret encounters. They met in hotels, secluded corners of the office, and anywhere they could be sure no one would catch them. Mark knew what he was doing was wrong. He loved Sarah, or at least he thought he did. But the thrill of the affair, the adrenaline rush that came with sneaking around, and the forbidden nature of their relationship had a hold on him that he couldn't shake. At home, Mark's behavior became more erratic. He started working later and later, using work as an excuse to meet Vanessa. Sarah, who had always trusted him implicitly, began to feel something was off. She noticed the way he avoided her gaze when he came home, the way he brushed off her questions with vague excuses about deadlines and stress. Her once happy-go-lucky husband had become distant, emotionally unavailable, and secretive. But Mark was too caught up in his double life to notice the toll it was taking on his marriage. Vanessa, too, was becoming more possessive. What started as an affair fueled by lust and power was now turning into something more dangerous. She wanted Mark all to herself and began pushing him to make a decision. "Leave her," Vanessa whispered one night as they lay in bed, her voice dripping with persuasion. "We could be so much more together. You know you want this." Mark was trapped, ensnared in a web of lies he had spun himself. The thrill was intoxicating, but the danger was growing. He was playing a dangerous game with no way out, and as the stakes got higher, he knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. As the affair between Mark and Vanessa intensified, the cracks in Mark's marriage to Sarah began to deepen. What had once been a happy, supportive relationship now felt strained, weighed down by Mark's growing deception. Sarah, once the center of Mark's life, had become an afterthought in the chaos he had created. His mind was constantly divided, and while he tried to maintain a sense of normalcy at home, the truth was slowly seeping through the cracks. Sarah, who had always been intuitive and sensitive to the changes in Mark's behavior, could no longer ignore the growing distance between them. For months, she had chalked up his late nights and emotional withdrawal to work stress. After all, he had been promoted, and with that came added responsibilities. But the excuses no longer held up. Mark's interactions with her had become mechanical, devoid of the warmth and affection they once shared. The intimacy they once cherished now felt cold and disconnected. He was always distracted, barely engaging in conversations, and the laughter that once filled their home had been replaced with tension and silence. Sarah's suspicions had started small, first with the long hours at work, the unexplained late-night meetings, and the vague text messages Mark received late into the evening. When she questioned him about it, he brushed her off, giving her generic answers that only deepened her unease. He assured her everything was fine, that work was just demanding, and that he was doing it all for their future. But Sarah knew better. She could sense that something was very wrong. One evening, after yet another late night at the office, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. While Mark was in the shower, she found his phone on the nightstand. Her heart raced as she hesitated, unsure if she really wanted to go down this path. But the nagging feeling that something was being kept from her overpowered her guilt, and with trembling hands she unlocked his phone. What she found confirmed her worst fears. A series of text messages between Mark and Vanessa, hidden under a contact name Mark had changed to David W., but the texts were unmistakable. The flirtatious tone, the suggestive language, the talk of missing last night and needing to see each other soon, left no doubt in Sarah's mind that her husband was having an affair. It wasn't just any affair, this was with his boss, a woman she had met several times at company functions and had never thought twice about. Sarah's stomach churned as she scrolled through the messages, her hands trembling and her heart breaking with each new revelation. This wasn't just a harmless flirtation, it was a full-blown betrayal. The man she had trusted, the man she had built her life with, was leading a double life. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized that everything she thought she knew about her marriage was crumbling before her. When Mark emerged from the shower, he was met with Sarah's icy silence. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line, and she held his phone in her hands. Mark froze, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the look in her eyes. He knew immediately what had happened. "Mark," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Who is Vanessa?" The room seemed to close in around him. Mark's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, an excuse that would somehow lessen the blow. But there was no excuse. Sarah had seen everything. There was no going back. For a moment, Mark considered telling her the whole truth, confessing to everything and begging for her forgiveness. But instead, he panicked. "It's not what you think," he blurted out, his voice shaky and unconvincing. It was nothing serious. We've just been talking, that's all." One evening, after yet another late night at the office, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. While Mark was in the shower, she found his phone on the nightstand. Her heart raced as she hesitated, unsure if she really wanted to go down this path. But the nagging feeling that something was being kept from her overpowered her guilt, and with trembling hands, she unlocked his phone. What she found confirmed her worst fears. A series of text messages between Mark and Vanessa, hidden under a contact name Mark, had changed to David W., but the texts were unmistakable. The flirtatious tone, the suggestive language, the talk of missing last night and needing to see each other soon, left no doubt in Sarah's mind that her husband was having an affair. It wasn't just any affair, this was with his boss, a woman she had met several times at company functions and had never thought twice about. Sarah's stomach churned as she scrolled through the messages, her hands trembling and her heart breaking with each new revelation. This wasn't just a harmless flirtation, it was a full-blown betrayal. The man she had trusted, the man she had built her life with, was leading a double life. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized that everything she thought she knew about her marriage was crumbling before her. When Mark emerged from the shower, he was met with Sarah's icy silence. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line, and she held his phone in her hands. Mark froze, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the look in her eyes. He knew immediately what had happened. "Mark," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Who is Vanessa?" The room seemed to close in around him. Mark's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, an excuse that would somehow lessen the blow. But there was no excuse. Sarah had seen everything. There was no going back. For a moment, Mark considered telling her the whole truth, confessing to everything and begging for her forgiveness. But instead, he panicked. "It's not what you think," he blurted out, his voice shaky and unconvincing. It was nothing serious. We've just been talking, that's all." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Just talking?" "Mark, I read the messages. This isn't just talking. You've been lying to me for months." Her voice cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Mark stood there, unable to find the words to explain himself. His mind was a whirlwind of guilt and shame, but at the same time he couldn't bring himself to end the affair. Vanessa's pull on him was too strong, and the thrill of their secret relationship was too intoxicating. Instead of owning up to his actions, he tried to downplay the severity of it, desperately trying to salvage whatever was left of his marriage. "It didn't mean anything, Sarah. I swear it's over." "I'm sorry," Mark lied, knowing full well that he had no intention of ending things with Vanessa. He was trapped in his own web of deceit, and he didn't know how to get out. But Sarah wasn't buying it. The trust between them was shattered, and the love she once felt for him had been replaced by anger and betrayal. She couldn't look at him the same way anymore. Every time she saw his face, she would be reminded of his lies, of the woman he had chosen over her. In the weeks that followed, the tension between them only grew. Sarah considered leaving him, but part of her still clung to the hope that they could somehow fix their broken marriage. She wasn't ready to walk away from the life they had built together, but every day felt like a painful reminder that their marriage was slipping through her fingers. Mark, meanwhile, felt the pressure mounting. The thrill of his affair with Vanessa was now overshadowed by the crumbling foundation of his marriage. He was losing control, and he knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The tension between Mark and Sarah had become unbearable. Every conversation turned into an argument. Every glance felt heavy with unspoken resentment. Sarah's once soft and loving demeanor had hardened, and Mark could sense that she was only a breath away from leaving him for good. He was walking on thin ice, trying to keep his affair with Vanessa alive while somehow holding on to what was left of his marriage. But the more he tried to manage both worlds, the more they began to collide. Vanessa, on the other hand, was growing increasingly impatient. What had started as an exciting affair was now becoming a source of frustration for her. She wanted more than secret rendezvous in hotels and stolen moments in the office. Vanessa was a woman used to getting what she wanted, and she wanted Mark all to herself. "I don't understand why you're still with her," Vanessa had said during one of their meetings, her voice sharp and demanding. "If you want to be with me, you need to leave Sarah. I'm not going to be the other woman forever." Mark felt the pressure closing in on him. Vanessa's ultimatum weighed heavily on his mind, but he couldn't bring himself to make a decision. Part of him was terrified of losing the stability that his marriage provided, while another part of him was intoxicated by Vanessa's power and allure. His indecision was tearing him apart, and it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Sarah, meanwhile, had reached her breaking point. She could no longer live in the shadow of Mark's betrayal, pretending that things could go back to the way they were. The trust was gone, and so was her patience. One evening, after another silent dinner filled with tension, Sarah decided to confront Mark once and for all. She couldn't live like this any longer, constantly wondering where his loyalties lay, questioning every late night and every phone call. "Mark, we need to talk," Sarah said as she stood in the doorway of their living room. Her voice was calm but firm, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. Mark looked up from his phone, his stomach knotting as he sensed the seriousness in her tone. About what he replied, though he knew exactly what she was going to say. About us. About what's been going on. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine. I know about Vanessa, Mark. I've known for a while. But I need to know the truth. Are you still seeing her?" Mark felt his heart drop into his stomach. His mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to explain himself without losing everything. But this time there was no room for half-truths or lies. Sarah wasn't going to accept vague excuses or hollow apologies anymore. "Yes," Mark finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still seeing her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah stood frozen, her worst fears confirmed, and the last bit of hope she had for saving their marriage crumbled before her eyes. Her hands trembled, and tears welled up, but she fought to keep her composure. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Why? Why wasn't I enough for you? After everything we've been through, how could you do this to me?" Mark had no answers. How could he explain the pull that Vanessa had on him? How could he justify destroying the life they had built together for a fleeting affair? He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Sarah's face twisted in pain, her voice rising with anger. "You selfish bastard," she screamed, her emotions finally boiling over. "You ruined everything." For what? For her she lunged at Mark, shoving him in the chest, her anger finally exploding into physical action. Mark stumbled backward, caught off guard by the force of her rage. "Sarah, stop," Mark shouted, trying to grab her arms to calm her down, but she was beyond reasoning. Years of bottled-up frustration, hurt, and betrayal came pouring out, and Sarah was no longer the soft, forgiving woman he had known. She was a force of anger and heartbreak. "Do you even care what you've done to me?" "To us," Sarah cried, her voice breaking with raw emotion. She grabbed a nearby photo frame, a picture of their wedding day, and hurled it at Mark. The frame shattered against the wall, the glass raining down in pieces on the floor. Before Mark could respond, they heard a knock at the front door. Both of them froze, their argument suspended in the air. Mark, still reeling from the confrontation, cautiously opened the door. It was Vanessa. She stood there, dressed impeccably as always, her expression unreadable, but her eyes filled with determination. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cool and confident, as if this was just another business meeting. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. Vanessa Pierce, the woman she had only ever known as Mark's boss, was now standing in her living room, intruding into the wreckage of her marriage. Sarah's face turned red with rage. "You," she screamed, pointing at Vanessa. "You're the one who ruined my marriage." Vanessa didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at Mark, ignoring Sarah's outburst. "I told you this would happen," she said calmly. "I told you to make a choice. Now it's time." The tension in the room was unbearable. Mark stood frozen between the two women, knowing that his double life had finally caught up with him. Sarah was crying now, her voice trembling with fury. "Get out. Both of you, just get out of my life." But before anyone could move, the situation took a deadly turn. Sarah, in a fit of rage and heartbreak, grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter, her hands shaking. "You think you can just waltz in here and take everything from me?" she screamed, her eyes wild with fury. Mark's eyes widened in horror. "Sarah, put the knife down," he shouted, stepping toward her, but it was too late. The confrontation had escalated beyond control, and the deadly consequences of Mark's betrayal were about to unfold. In the heat of the moment, a single, irreversible action would shatter their lives forever. In the blink of an eye, the room became a battlefield. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the knife, her heart pounding in her chest. All the anger, pain, and betrayal that had built up inside her over the past months surged forward, fueling her every move. Mark's face went pale as he stepped back, his mind racing for a way to defuse the situation. But Sarah was beyond reason now. She had been pushed to the edge, and there was no pulling her back. "Sarah, stop," Mark shouted, his voice thick with desperation. "This isn't you. You don't want to do this." But Sarah wasn't listening. The betrayal had shattered her, and the only thing she could see was the woman who had destroyed her life standing in her living room. Vanessa stood frozen, a look of shock spreading across her face as she realized the danger she was in. This was not how she had envisioned this moment. She had come to force Mark's hand, to make him choose her over his wife once and for all. But now she found herself at the mercy of a heartbroken woman pushed too far. "You think you can just take him from me?" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "You think you can walk into my house, into my marriage, and destroy everything we've built?" Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, to try to diffuse the situation, but no words came out. She could see the wild look in Sarah's eyes, the kind of madness that could only come from deep, soul-crushing betrayal. "Sarah, please," Mark pleaded, stepping forward, trying to put himself between the two women. "Just put the knife down. We can talk about this." But Sarah was past talking. She lunged toward Vanessa, the knife raised, her hands shaking with a mixture of fury and fear. In the chaos, Mark instinctively grabbed her arm, trying to stop her from doing something she would regret. The struggle between them was frantic, with Mark desperately trying to wrestle the knife from her grip, but Sarah was relentless, driven by a combination of pain and rage that made her stronger than he expected. In the confusion, the knife slipped from Sarah's hand and clattered to the floor. For a brief moment, the room was still, everyone frozen in shock. But the stillness didn't last long. As Mark turned to pick up the knife, Vanessa, seeing her opportunity, made a desperate move. In her panic, she shoved Sarah hard, sending her stumbling backward into the kitchen counter. Sarah gasped, more in surprise than pain, as her hand knocked over a glass that shattered on the tile floor. Her anger flared again, and she lashed out at Vanessa, slapping her across the face. Vanessa recoiled, her cheek stinging from the blow, but her shock quickly turned to fury. "I didn't take anything from you," Vanessa spat, her eyes flashing with anger. "Mark came to me. He wanted to be with me. Maybe if you were a better wife, he wouldn't have had to." The words were a dagger to Sarah's heart. Any restraint she had left shattered, and before Mark could react, Sarah lunged at Vanessa again. This time, Vanessa fought back, and the two women tumbled to the floor in a wild, chaotic struggle. Mark, caught between the two of them, tried to pull them apart, but in the confusion, something terrible happened. Sarah's hand found the knife again, and in the heat of the moment, as she tried to defend herself, the blade slashed through the air. There was a gasp, a sharp, choking sound, and then silence. Mark stared in horror as Vanessa collapsed to the floor, blood spreading quickly across her chest. Her eyes were wide with shock and pain, her hands grasping at the wound as if she could somehow stop the inevitable. The room seemed to spin around Mark as he knelt beside her, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. "No, no, no," he shouted, his voice shaking with panic. "Vanessa, stay with me." But it was too late. Vanessa's breathing became shallow, her eyes losing focus as the life drained out of her. Within moments, she was gone, her body limp on the cold tile floor. Sarah stood frozen, her face pale as the reality of what she had done sank in. The knife fell from her hand, clattering to the floor with a hollow sound that echoed in the silent room. She stared at Vanessa's lifeless body, her mind numb, unable to comprehend the enormity of her actions. "I didn't mean to," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." But the words felt empty. The truth was undeniable. Vanessa was dead,
Mark's heart
and
pounded
Sarah
in
had
his
killed
chest
her.
as
He stood up, his mind racing with fear and disbelief. His entire life had unraveled in the span of minutes. The woman he had betrayed his wife for was dead, and his wife was the one who had killed her. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fix the unfixable. The room was thick with tension and grief. Sarah looked at Mark, tears streaming down her face, her expression a mixture of horror and regret. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark couldn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The deadly love triangle he had created had spiraled out of control, and now there was no going back. Everything he had once valued, his marriage, his affair, his carefully constructed life, was destroyed in a single moment of rage and betrayal. As the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, Mark realized that this was the end. The police would arrive soon, and there would be no hiding the truth. The affair, the lies, the betrayal, everything would come out. Sarah would be arrested, and Vanessa's death would be all over the news. His life, as he knew it, was over. He looked at Sarah, the woman he had once loved, now standing in the ruins of their shattered marriage, and felt a deep, crushing guilt. This wasn't just her fault. It wasn't just Vanessa's fault. It was his fault, too. He had set all of this in motion, and now he was paying the ultimate price. As the police arrived and the flashing lights filled the room, Mark's heart sank. There was no escaping the consequences of his choices. The love triangle had turned deadly, and in the end it had destroyed them all.